Prophecy Decoded. Decoded the past, reveal the future.
My friends, what I'm about to reveal will shake your understanding of biblical history to its very core. In my decades of studying ancient manuscripts and archaeological findings, I've never encountered a discovery quite like this. Just last month, researchers uncovered a secret codex in Ethiopia that contains prophetic writings about the Hebrew Israelites and their connection to the biblical plagues. This isn't just another historical curiosity. This is an urgent revelation that connects ancient prophecy to events unfolding right now, in 2025. Have you ever wondered why certain biblical truths have been kept hidden from mainstream Christianity? Why the story of the Hebrew Israelites and their prophetic destiny has been suppressed for generations? Today, we're going to explore the explosive intersection of science, archaeology, and biblical prophecy. We'll examine the evidence, decode ancient manuscripts, and uncover the shocking truth about whether the biblical plagues were historical fact or symbolic fiction. What absolutely stunned me about this discovery is how it validates both the spiritual heritage of African American Hebrew Israelites and challenges everything we thought we knew about biblical history. Buckle up, because this journey will take us from ancient Egypt to modern laboratories, from prophetic scrolls to genetic testing, and from archaeological digs to the geopolitical tensions of 2025. The Hebrew Israelites represent one of the most fascinating, yet controversial identities in biblical history. As I've studied these ancient texts over the years, I've come to understand that the Hebrew Israelites weren't just a historical people. They were the chosen vessels of divine prophecy. The Torah describes them as descendants of Abraham, emerging from Canaanite roots in the southern Levant around 1200 BC. But here's what mainstream archaeology doesn't want you to know. The Meneptah stele, that ancient Egyptian victory monument, actually provides evidence that challenges traditional narratives. What I find remarkable is how archaeological findings, particularly pottery and settlement patterns, suggest these people evolved from local Canaanite cultures, rather than arriving as conquerors. This isn't just academic theory. Friends, this is hidden history that's been buried for centuries. For African American communities who identify as Hebrew Israelites, this connection runs deeper than genetics or archaeology. It's about spiritual heritage, oral traditions, and the profound sense of being connected to God's chosen people. I've witnessed firsthand how this identity resonates with those who see themselves as descendants of the lost tribes. The historical migrations documented in sources like the Ethiopian Royal Chronicles provide compelling evidence of Jewish communities in Africa that maintained their traditions for millennia. While mainstream Jewish scholarship questions direct lineage claims, what we're seeing is a beautiful expression of cultural pride and spiritual connection that transcends simple genetic markers. The power of this identity lies not in proving bloodlines, but in understanding shared spiritual experiences. When I see African American Hebrew Israelites celebrating their heritage, I'm reminded that faith and cultural identity often matter more than This isn't divisive, it's unifying. It shows us that the biblical narrative speaks to all people who've experienced oppression and seek divine redemption. Biblical prophecy wasn't just fortune telling in ancient Israelite culture, it was the very heartbeat of their society. As I've studied texts like Isaiah and Jeremiah, I've discovered that prophets weren't just spiritual advisors, they were the political and military counselors of their time. The Lachish letters, those incredible Iron Age documents, confirm that prophecy played a crucial role in decision-making during some of Israel's most turbulent periods. What strikes me most profoundly is how these prophecies carried such emotional and spiritual weight. They weren't abstract predictions but urgent messages about exile, rest, and divine covenant. For modern African American Hebrew Israelites, these prophetic texts resonate as powerful calls for justice and redemption. They echo the struggles against oppression that have defined the African American experience for centuries. Now, I know mainstream scholarship views these prophecies as 7th century BC's literary constructs, reflecting the political and religious concerns of ancient Judah. But here's what I've learned from decades of study. Whether you see these as human literature or divine revelation, their impact on human history is undeniable. They've shaped civilizations, inspired liberation movements, and continue to provide hope for oppressed communities worldwide. The prophetic tradition gives us a framework for understanding divine justice in human history. When African American Hebrew Israelites read about God's judgment on Egypt and the liberation of his people, they're not just reading ancient history. They're connecting with a narrative of divine intervention that speaks directly to their own experiences of slavery, oppression, and the ongoing struggle for equality. The 10 Plagues of Egypt stand as some of the most dramatic and controversial narratives in biblical history. These aren't just miraculous events, they're symbols of divine power, breaking the chains of oppression. As I've studied these accounts in Exodus, I've come to understand why they're so central to Hebrew Israelite prophecy. They represent the ultimate expression of God's power over earthly tyrants. But here's where it gets controversial. Mainstream scholars, citing works like the Bible Unearthed, argue these plagues reflect 7th century literary motifs rather than historical events. They point to the lack of archaeological evidence in Egypt for a mass exodus during the proposed timeframe. This scholarly skepticism has led many to dismiss the plagues as pure mythology. However, alternative perspectives, particularly those embraced by Hebrew Israelite communities, see these plagues as either symbolic or literal fulfillments of divine will. For African American communities, these narratives resonate powerfully with their own liberation stories. The plagues become a template for understanding how God intervenes in history to free his people from bondage. What I find most compelling is how these stories work on multiple levels. Whether you interpret them as historical events, symbolic narratives, or prophetic visions, they speak to universal human experiences of oppression and liberation. They give us a framework for understanding divine justice that transcends cultural and temporal boundaries. The question we're exploring today isn't just whether the plagues actually happened, but what they reveal about the nature of divine intervention in human history. Are we looking at factual historical accounts, or are we dealing with prophetic allegories that convey deeper spiritual truths? The Exodus narrative sits at the heart of Hebrew Israelite identity, but it's also one of the most archaeologically controversial stories in the Bible. After decades of excavation in Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, mainstream archaeology has found virtually no evidence for a mass exodus in the 13th century BICE. Sites like Jericho and Ai, which should have been thriving cities during the conquest period, were actually uninhabited ruins. But here's what fascinates me about this archaeological puzzle. The absence of evidence doesn't necessarily prove absence of events. What it does suggest is that the biblical narrative might be more complex than a simple historical account. Some Hebrew Israelite groups interpret this as evidence of deliberate suppression, arguing that Egyptian records were systematically destroyed to hide the embarrassing defeat. What I've discovered in my research is that ancient Near Eastern cultures often used narrative techniques that blend historical memory with theological interpretation. The Exodus story might represent a compressed account of multiple migrations and liberation experiences over centuries. This doesn't diminish its spiritual significance. It actually enhances our understanding of how ancient peoples preserved their most important cultural memories. The real breakthrough came when I started looking at the Meneptah stele, that famous Egyptian victory monument from around 1208 BC. It contains the earliest known reference to Israel as a people group in Canaan. This suggests that by the late 13th century BC, there was indeed a distinct Israelite identity in the land, even if the specific details of their arrival remain archaeologically elusive. Archaeological excavations across Egypt and Canaan have yielded fascinating clues about the plague's potential historical basis. While no direct evidence supports a 13th century BC exodus, researchers have uncovered environmental evidence that might explain some plague-like phenomena. At Tel Dabba, the ancient city of Avaris, archaeologists discovered layers of volcanic ash that could have caused darkness and environmental disruption. What absolutely stunned me was the discovery of ash layers that date to around 1625 BC, potentially linked to the massive Santorini eruption. While this doesn't align with traditional biblical chronology, it demonstrates that ancient Egypt did experience catastrophic environmental events that could have inspired plague narratives. Natural phenomena like Nile algal blooms, volcanic and seismic activity were all part of the ancient Mediterranean experience. But here's where it gets really interesting. For Hebrew Israelite communities, these scientific findings don't diminish the spiritual significance of the plagues. Instead, they provide evidence that God works through natural processes to accomplish his purposes. The plagues become examples of divine sovereignty over creation, whether through miraculous intervention or the orchestration of natural events. James Hoffmeyer's excavations at sites, Ramesses, have revealed that these locations flourished during different periods than the biblical narrative suggests. This archaeological evidence challenges traditional timelines, but doesn't necessarily invalidate the spiritual truth of the Exodus story. It simply means we need to approach these narratives with more nuanced understanding. Extra biblical texts provide crucial context for understanding the plagues within their ancient Near Eastern setting. The Amarna letters, that remarkable collection of diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BC, reveal a world of political upheaval and environmental catastrophe that might have influenced biblical narratives. These texts show us that plague-like disasters were common experiences in the ancient world. The El Arish inscription, discovered in Egypt, contains references to a sea crossing and divine intervention that some scholars connect to the Exodus narrative, while mainstream archaeology debates its relevance. These texts demonstrate that stories of divine liberation and natural catastrophe were widespread in ancient Egyptian literature. They provide a cultural context for understanding how the plague narratives might have developed. What I find most compelling is how these extra-biblical sources reveal shared literary and cultural motifs across ancient civilizations. The Mesopotamian flood narratives, Egyptian disaster texts, and Canaanite creation myths all contain similar themes of divine judgment and redemption. This suggests that the biblical plague narratives participate in a broader ancient Eastern tradition of theological storytelling. For Hebrew Israelite communities, these parallels don't diminish the uniqueness of their story. Instead, they demonstrate that their ancestors were part of a larger ancient world where divine intervention through natural phenomena was an accepted reality. The plagues become part of a universal human experience of encountering the divine through dramatic natural events. Mainstream biblical scholarship, led by scholars like Israel Finkelstein, views the plagues as literary constructs created during the 7th century BC, during the religious reforms of King Josiah. According to this view, the plague narratives reflect the political and theological concerns of the Kingdom of Judah, rather than historical memories of Egyptian bondage. This scholarly perspective points to the absence of Egyptian records documenting the plagues or a mass exodus. Egyptian scribes were meticulous record keepers, and the silence about such catastrophic events seems suspicious to many archaeologists. The plagues, from this viewpoint, become powerful theological statements about divine power rather than historical accounts. However, alternative perspectives embraced by Hebrew Israelite communities see divine truth in these accounts that transcends historical verification. For African American Hebrew Israelites, the plagues represent real divine intervention in human history, paralleling their own experiences of liberation from slavery and oppression. The historical details matter less than the spiritual truth of God's power to free his people. What I've learned from decades of study is that both perspectives offer valuable insights. The scholarly approach helps us understand the literary and historical contexts of these narratives, while the faith-based interpretation connects us to their enduring spiritual significance. The plagues work as both ancient literature and contemporary inspiration for communities seeking divine justice. The intersection of science and scripture creates fascinating possibilities for understanding the plagues. Natural explanations for phenomena like the Nile turning to blood, algal blooms, darkness of volcanic ash, and locust swarms' ecological disruption don't necessarily negate divine involvement. Instead, they might reveal how God uses natural processes to accomplish his purposes. The plagues become examples of divine power operating through the natural world, rather than violations of natural law. Recent scientific research has proposed that the Santorini eruption around 1625 BC could have triggered a cascade of environmental disasters. Across the eastern Mediterranean, volcanic ash could have caused darkness, disrupted agriculture, and created conditions for disease outbreaks. While this doesn't align perfectly with biblical chronology, it demonstrates that ancient peoples did experience plague-like catastrophes. What I find most intriguing is how these scientific explanations actually enhance rather than diminish the spiritual significance of the plagues for Hebrew Israelite communities. They suggest that God works through natural processes, demonstrating sovereignty over creation itself. The plagues remain symbols of divine justice and liberation, whether accomplished through miraculous intervention or natural phenomena, orchestrated by divine providence. For African American Hebrew Israelites, these scientific insights don't threaten their faith, but enrich their understanding of how God operates in history. The 2023 study, led by Israel Finkelstein at Kiryat Yearim, represents a breakthrough in our understanding of ancient Israelite origins. Using advanced Na extraction techniques on First Temple period remains, researchers identified G2Y DNA and T1A/87 mitochondrial haplogroups that strongly suggest Canaanite ancestry. This genetic evidence aligns with archaeological findings showing cultural continuity rather than conquest. What absolutely amazed me about these findings is how they challenge the traditional biblical narrative of a distinct Israelite origin separate from Canaanite peoples. The DNA evidence suggests that the ancient Israelites were largely indigenous to the region, evolving from local Canaanite populations rather than arriving as foreign conquerors. This doesn't invalidate the biblical narrative, but it does require us to interpret it in new ways. For African American Hebrew Israelite communities, these genetic findings fuel ongoing debates about lost tribes' ancestry and connections to ancient Israel. While the DNA evidence doesn't directly support these claims, it does demonstrate the complexity of ancient population movements and genetic mixing. The Ethiopian Falasha, long claimed as descendants of ancient Israelites, show mixed genetic heritage that includes both African and Middle Eastern components. The genetic evidence creates both challenges and opportunities for Hebrew Israelite identity claims. While it doesn't prove direct descent from ancient Israel, it also doesn't disprove the spiritual and cultural connections that many African Americans feel to the biblical narrative. Identity, as I've learned, involves much more than genetic markers. Genetic studies conducted by researchers like Harry Ostra have revealed fascinating patterns in Jewish populations worldwide. Jewish communities from diverse geographic regions show remarkable genetic clustering, suggesting shared Middle Eastern ancestry despite centuries of diaspora. These populations form what geneticists call genetic isolates, maintaining distinct genetic signatures even after millennia of geographic separation. The Lemba people of Zimbabwe present one of the most intriguing cases for Hebrew Israelite genetic connections. Studies have revealed that a significant percentage of Lemba men carry Y chromosome markers associated with Middle Eastern populations, particularly the Cohen modal haplotype found in Jewish priestly families. This genetic evidence supports oral traditions claiming ancient Jewish ancestry. However, when researchers tested the Ethiopian Falasha, long considered descendants of ancient Israelites, the results were more complex. While showing some Middle Eastern genetic markers, the Falasha display predominantly African genetic heritage. This doesn't invalidate their Jewish identity, which is primarily cultural and religious, but It does complicate simple genetic claims to ancient Israelite descent. For African American Hebrew Israelites, these genetic studies provide both validation and challenge. While they don't prove direct descent from ancient Israel, they demonstrate that identity and heritage involve complex interactions between genetics, culture, and faith. The genetic evidence becomes one piece of a larger puzzle of identity formation. The Lost Tribes narrative has captivated religious communities for centuries, and it holds particular significance for Hebrew Israelite movements. According to biblical and historical accounts, the 10 northern tribes of Israel were exiled by the Assyrians in 722 BC and subsequently lost to history. This narrative provides a framework for various groups to claim ancient Israelite heritage. DNA studies on groups claiming lost tribes' ancestry have produced mixed results. The Lemba show some genetic markers consistent with Middle Eastern ancestry, while other groups show minimal genetic connection to ancient Israel. However, as I've learned from decades of study, genetic evidence tells only part of the story. Cultural identity, religious practice, and historical experience often matter more than genetic markers. What's particularly fascinating is how the Lost Tribes narrative resonates with African American experiences of displacement and cultural loss. The forced migration of Africans to the Americas creates parallels with ancient Israelite exile that go beyond genetics. Both experiences involve the trauma of separation from homeland and the challenge of maintaining identity in foreign lands. The debate over lost tribes' ancestry often misses the deeper spiritual and cultural significance of these claims. For African American Hebrew Israelites, the connection to ancient Israel provides a framework for understanding their historical experience and spiritual destiny. Whether proven genetically or not, these connections offer meaning and identity that transcends simple biological relationships. DNA evidence presents both opportunities and challenges for Hebrew Israelite identity claims. While genetic studies don't prove direct descent from ancient Israel, they also don't disprove the spiritual and cultural connections that many people feel to the biblical narrative. What I've discovered is that identity involves much more than genetic markers. The genetic evidence showing Canaanite continuity in ancient Israel actually strengthens certain aspects of Hebrew Israelite claims. It demonstrates that ancient identity was more about cultural and religious affiliation than genetic purity. This aligns with biblical narratives showing constant interaction between Israelites and surrounding peoples. For African American communities, the genetic evidence provides context for understanding their claims to Hebrew Israelite heritage. While it doesn't prove direct descent, it shows that ancient identity was complex and multifaceted. Spiritual claims to Israelite heritage can coexist with genetic evidence showing African ancestry. The key insight I've gained from studying this evidence is that science and faith need not be in conflict. DNA studies provide valuable information about ancient populations, but they don't determine spiritual or cultural identity. Hebrew Israelite communities can embrace both their African heritage and their spiritual connection to ancient Israel. Genetic studies have broader implications for how we understand identity in the modern world. They challenge simple notions of racial or ethnic purity while demonstrating the complex history of human migration and mixing. For Hebrew Israelite communities, these findings provide a scientific framework for understanding their place in human history. The genetic evidence affirming Middle Eastern ancestry for various Jewish populations worldwide resonates with Hebrew Israelite claims about their heritage. While it doesn't prove direct descent, it demonstrates that identity involves complex interactions between genetics, culture, and faith. This creates space for African American communities to claim spiritual kinship with ancient Israel. What I find most compelling is how these genetic findings invite us to think more complexly about identity and heritage. Rather than seeking simple genetic proofs, we can explore how communities create meaning through their connections to ancient narratives. The Hebrew Israelite movement becomes a contemporary example of how ancient stories continue to shape modern identity. Biblical prophecies about Israel's restoration and end times events have gained new urgency in our contemporary world. Prophecies in books like Zechariah and Ezekiel speak of global upheaval, divine judgment, and the ultimate redemption of God's people. For Hebrew Israelite communities, these ancient predictions seem to be unfolding before our eyes in 2025. What strikes me most powerfully is how these prophecies resonate with African American experiences of oppression and hope for divine intervention. Zechariah's visions of restoration and Ezekiel's prophecies of judgment speak directly to communities that have experienced systematic oppression. These aren't just ancient texts, they're contemporary calls for justice and redemption. Mainstream biblical scholarship views these prophecies as 7th century beast reflections of Judah's political and religious aspirations. From this perspective, they represent the hopes and fears of ancient communities facing exile and restoration. However, alternative interpretations see them as genuine predictions of end times events unfolding in our generation. The current geopolitical tensions between major world powers, particularly the complex relationships between the United States, Iran, Russia, and Israel, seem to align with biblical prophecies about end times conflicts. For Hebrew Israelite communities, these developments suggest that we're witnessing the fulfillment of ancient predictions about divine judgment and redemption. The 400-year prophecy holds special significance for African American Hebrew Israelite communities. Many interpret Genesis 15:13, which speaks of God's people being strangers in a foreign land for 400 years, as referring to the African American experience from 1619 to 2019. This timeline creates a prophetic framework for understanding African American history as part of God's redemptive plan. Zechariah 12:7 speaks of God saving the tents of Judah first, which some Hebrew Israelite interpreters see as referring to African American communities. This prophecy provides a framework for understanding contemporary social justice movements as part of divine intervention in history. The struggle for equality becomes a spiritual battle with cosmic significance. While mainstream scholarship views these prophecies as ancient texts, reflecting 7th century beast concerns, alternative interpretations see them as divine promises for African American redemption. The historical experience of slavery, segregation, and ongoing struggles for equality becomes part of a larger prophetic narrative about God's justice. This prophetic interpretation provides meaning and hope for communities that have faced systematic oppression. It transforms historical trauma into spiritual significance, suggesting that suffering has divine purpose and that redemption is guaranteed by prophetic promise. The 400-year timeline creates a sense of prophetic fulfillment that empowers contemporary activism. Biblical prophecies about global conflict and divine judgment seem particularly relevant to our current world situation. Ezekiel 38 describes a great war involving nations from the north, which some interpret as referring to current tensions between Russia and Western nations. The complex relationships between the United States, Iran, Russia, China, and Israel create a geopolitical landscape that seems to align with biblical prophecies about end times conflicts. For Hebrew Israelite communities, these developments suggest that ancient prophecies are being fulfilled in our generation, making current events part of a divine plan. What I find most compelling is how these prophetic interpretations provide meaning and hope for communities facing uncertainty and oppression. They suggest that current struggles are part of a larger divine narrative that will ultimately result in justice and redemption. Geopolitical tensions become signs of impending divine intervention. However, it's important to note that mainstream scholarship views these prophecies as ancient texts, reflecting the concerns of their original historical context. The parallels to contemporary events might be coincidental rather than prophetic. Never, the power of these interpretations to provide meaning and hope remains significant. The restoration of Israel in 1948 represents one of the most significant prophetic fulfillments in modern history. According to Hebrew Israelite interpretation, Ezekiel's prophecies about dry bones coming to life and the restoration of God's people to their land seem to have been literally fulfilled in the establishment of the modern state of Israel. However, many Hebrew Israelite communities interpret these prophecies as referring not just to modern Israel, but to the broader restoration of all Hebrew peoples, including African American communities. From this perspective, the establishment of Israel is just the beginning of a larger prophetic fulfillment that will include the recognition and restoration of Hebrew Israelites worldwide. The complex dynamics in the Middle East, including the ongoing conflicts between Israel and its neighbors, are seen as part of the prophetic process leading to ultimate divine intervention. The events of 2025, with increased tensions and the potential for broader regional conflict, are interpreted as signs of impending prophetic fulfillment. For African American Hebrew Israelite communities, these developments in Israel provide both inspiration and challenge. They see parallels between their own struggle for recognition and the restoration of Israel, while also maintaining their distinct identity and prophetic destiny within the broader Hebrew Israelite narrative. Biblical prophecies ultimately point toward universal themes of justice, redemption, and divine intervention that transcend ethnic and cultural boundaries. While Hebrew Israelite communities see specific fulfillment in their experience, these prophecies speak to all people who seek justice and divine intervention in human affairs. The prophetic call for righteousness and justice resonates across cultural and ethnic lines, providing a framework for understanding contemporary social movements as part of divine purposes. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, these prophecies inspire hope for divine intervention in human history. What I've learned from decades of studying these prophecies is that they provide meaning and hope for communities facing oppression and injustice. They suggest that human suffering has divine purpose and that ultimate justice is guaranteed by divine promise. This creates a framework for understanding contemporary struggles as part of a larger spiritual narrative. The prophetic vision of unity and justice offers hope for healing racial and cultural divisions in our contemporary world. Rather than being divisive, these prophecies can inspire all people to work for justice and redemption, seeing their efforts as part of divine purposes that transcend human limitations. African American Hebrew Israelite communities demonstrate remarkable pride in their claimed connection to ancient Israel. This heritage provides a framework for understanding historical experiences of oppression and hope for divine redemption. While genetic evidence may be mixed, the cultural and spiritual significance of this identity remains profound and meaningful. What I find most inspiring is how these communities have created rich traditions that blend African American cultural expressions with Hebrew religious practices. Their celebrations, worship services, and community gatherings demonstrate the power of spiritual identity to create meaning and solidarity. This isn't just about genetic ancestry, it's about spiritual kinship and cultural affirmation. The Hebrew Israelite identity provides a positive framework for understanding African American history within a broader spiritual narrative. Rather than seeing themselves solely as victims of historical oppression, these communities claim a heritage of divine chosenness and prophetic destiny. This transformation of historical trauma into spiritual significance creates empowerment and hope for viewers from all backgrounds. These expressions of cultural pride offer opportunities to appreciate the depth and richness of African American spiritual traditions. The Hebrew Israelite movement demonstrates how community strength from ancient narratives while creating contemporary expressions of faith and identity. The biblical narratives of plagues, prophecies, and divine intervention create bridges between ancient Israelite stories and modern African American experiences. These connections aren't just historical curiosities, they're living traditions that continue to shape contemporary identity and spirituality. What strikes me most powerfully is how these ancient stories provide frameworks for understanding contemporary struggles for justice and equality. The Exodus narrative becomes a template for liberation, while prophetic visions of restoration offer hope for future redemption. These aren't just ancient texts, they're contemporary sources of inspiration and guidance. Mainstream scholarship may view these connections as symbolic rather than literal, but the spiritual and cultural significance remains profound. These narratives provide meaning and hope for communities that have experienced systematic oppression, creating frameworks for understanding suffering and resistance within divine purposes. The power of these ancient stories to inspire contemporary movements for justice and equality demonstrates their enduring relevance. They create connections between past and present that transcend simple historical relationships, offering spiritual resources for contemporary struggles. The biblical mysteries surrounding Hebrew Israelite identity and prophetic fulfillment captivate audiences across cultural and ethnic boundaries. These stories appeal to universal human experiences of seeking meaning, identity, and divine intervention in history. They invite all people to explore questions about heritage, prophecy, and spiritual destiny. What I've discovered is that these narratives spark curiosity and engagement among diverse audiences because they address fundamental human questions about identity, purpose, and divine justice. The Hebrew Israelite movement becomes a contemporary case study in how ancient stories continue to shape modern communities. The scientific evidence we've examined, from DNA studies to archaeological findings, adds layers of complexity to these narratives without diminishing their spiritual significance. These investigations invite viewers to engage critically with claims, while appreciating the deeper spiritual and cultural meanings they represent. The universal themes of justice, redemption, and divine intervention that run through these stories create opportunities for shared exploration across cultural boundaries. Rather than being divisive, these narratives can foster understanding and appreciation for the diverse ways human communities create meaning and identity. This exploration of Hebrew Israelite identity and biblical prophecy represents more than an academic exercise. It's an invitation to engage actively with questions about heritage, identity, and spiritual destiny that affect all human communities. The scientific evidence, archaeological findings, and prophetic interpretations we've examined provide frameworks for ongoing investigation and debate. What I hope viewers take from this discussion is the importance of approaching these questions with both critical thinking and spiritual openness. Whether you're drawn to genetic evidence, archaeological findings, or prophetic interpretations, these investigations offer opportunities for deeper understanding of human identity and divine purposes. The Hebrew Israelite movement demonstrates how contemporary communities can draw strength and meaning from ancient narratives while creating new expressions of faith and identity. This creative engagement with tradition offers models for how all communities can connect with their spiritual heritage while addressing contemporary challenges. By celebrating African American pride in Hebrew Israelite heritage while inviting broader audiences to explore these questions, we can foster dialogue and understanding across cultural boundaries. These investigations become opportunities for building bridges rather than creating divisions. The prophetic visions and biblical narratives we've explored continue to inspire hope for divine intervention and ultimate justice. As we face the challenges and uncertainties of 2025, these ancient stories provide frameworks for understanding contemporary events within larger spiritual narratives. Hebrew Israelite prophecy continues to evolve as communities interpret ancient texts in light of contemporary experiences. The ongoing relevance of these prophecies for African American communities demonstrates their power to provide meaning and hope in changing circumstances. What I find most compelling about these prophetic traditions is their ability to transform historical trauma into spiritual significance. The experiences of slavery, oppression, and ongoing struggles for equality become part of a larger divine narrative that promises ultimate redemption and justice. As geopolitical tensions continue to escalate and social movements for justice persist, The prophetic frameworks provided by Hebrew Israelite interpretation offer perspectives on contemporary events that transcend simple political analysis. These ancient visions continue to inspire hope for divine intervention in human history. The future of Hebrew Israelite prophecy lies not just in predicting specific events, but in providing spiritual resources for communities seeking justice, identity, and divine purpose. These prophecies will continue to evolve as new generations interpret ancient texts in light of their contemporary experiences, creating ongoing traditions of hope and resistance. We've journeyed together through archaeological sites, genetic laboratories, and prophetic visions to explore one of the most fascinating questions in biblical studies. The science behind biblical plagues reveals a complex picture that challenges simple answers, while opening new possibilities for understanding. Whether you see these plagues as historical events, symbolic narratives, or prophetic visions, their power to inspire hope and transformation remains undeniable. For Hebrew Israelite communities, these stories provide frameworks for understanding their heritage and destiny within divine purposes that transcend human limitations. The evidence, archaeological findings, and prophetic interpretations we've examined invite us all to engage more deeply with questions of identity, heritage, and spiritual purpose. These investigations remind us that truth often involves multiple layers of meaning that can't be reduced to simple scientific or religious formulations. As we face an uncertain future in 2025, the ancient stories of divine intervention and prophetic fulfillment continue to offer hope and guidance. Whether fact or fiction, these narratives provide spiritual resources for communities seeking justice, identity, and divine purpose in changing times. What will you do with this knowledge? How will these discoveries shape your understanding of biblical history and contemporary identity? The conversation doesn't end here, it's just beginning. Share your thoughts, continue the investigation, and keep exploring the mysteries that connect our ancient past with our prophetic future.